Welcome to Human Talent in the age of robots, AI, machine learning, and automation. So we've got a mouthful to talk about. So I really want to do three things with this panel. One is kind of take a look at the high-level implications to the labor market that are happening as a result of these technologies. Two, really give you a framework to evaluate these technologies, because inevitably you're going to be encountering them in the wild. And then the last one is, really what is this AI thing and why should we care about it? And so we're going to kind of start at the very practical level, which is sort of, what is AI, what are these guys applying it for, and what problems is it solving? And then we'll kind of work our way back up. And so we've got a really unique panel here today. All four of these folks are founders and people who are employing machine learning and various other techniques to solve very important problems in the world as it relates to both education and easing the pain of administration. And so let's just give you a quick introduction. We have Elijah, who is VP of New Technology at Turnitin. Prior to that, he was founder at Lightside Labs, and he has his PhD from CMU, which, if you guys don't know, is one of those AI powerhouses. We have Andrew we've got Arjun next. We've got Arjun, who's CEO and co-founder of Gradescope. They just announced their funding today, so they're fully public in the world. So one of many babies to be birthed. So next we have Andrew Smith-Lewis, who's the founder and chairman of Cerego. Then we've got Maran, founder and CEO of Clara Labs. So in order to keep this grounded, where I really wanted to start, guys, is let's just tell us a little bit about the specific problem that you're solving and why you chose to do it, so sort of the human side. We'll start with you, Elijah.
Sure. At Turnitin, I'm working on our new product, Revision Assistant, which is aimed primarily at middle and high school writing and ELA, English Language Arts classrooms, giving students the opportunity to revise, get feedback on their work, and iterate through the drafting process of writing with automated feedback so that the students really take ownership over that process prior to and during the conversations that they're having with teachers, and then expanding from that K-12 space into higher ed and then into English language learning more broadly.
Cool. So at Gradescope, we're trying to help instructors grade their students' work more efficiently and effectively. So this started out by just helping them get, so typically instructors take out a red pen and they grade these stacks and stacks of paper. I was one of those TAs at Berkeley. And the first step was just getting it online. So instead of grading with a red pen, you grade it on a computer, but it's still a manual process. And the next thing we're working on is actually looking at what's being graded and using all of this data, all of this grading work that's been done to actually help the instructor grade. So we're not trying to automate the grading, we're just trying to give them a couple of hints and group things together so they can grade things and scale up the grading labor without having to resort to things like multiple choice questions, which is kind of the go-to thing if you want to teach a 1,000-student course right now.
Cool. At Cerego, we are building a platform that's designed to help people acquire and demonstrate knowledge and capability. And it revolves around a lot of applied research into learning science and memory, and it's really focused on how we learn and remember information. So it's less about the content, the what, or where it happens, but it's really about how we learn and acquire and basically hang on to any information for any subject.
And at Clara Labs, we have designed Clara, who is an artificial intelligence who is also actually backed by humans in the case that we can't reliably parse scheduling work. So if you wanted to use Clara, you would host Clara at your domain, and the same way that an assistant would, Clara could have a conversation about scheduling meetings for you.
And I was so excited about these guys that I didn't tell you what context I was coming from. So I'm Shivon Zilis. I'm a partner at a fund called Bloomberg Beta. We exist to invest in companies that are defining the future of work. And so within that, I specifically focus on just the world of machine intelligence. And so we have over 25 investments in the space. We expect that to pick up. But again, from that lens, we learn that machine learning, artificial intelligence, machine intelligence, whatever term you want to give it, is sort of not one blanket thing. It's a whole suite of, essentially it's the world of learning algorithms. And so what I really wanted to do with these guys is have them talk to you a little bit about what particular techniques they're using within the world of machine learning, so it seems kind of less overwhelming, and why they're actually using that technique. What problem does it actually help you solve? And so why don't we start with you, Maran?
And I know this was on we reviewed this a little bit beforehand, but to give you some idea of what machine learning actually is, it's math. It is predictions, right? It is you trying to train something to make predictions in a way that a human might. the reason that machine learning is really interesting to me is because you can train something to behave in a way that a human would otherwise behave, and software otherwise doesn't have any conception of how to behave intelligently or communicate in ways that are analogous to how a human might. I don't know if this is...
I think mine's causing a problem. So let's delve into that just a little bit. So essentially you guys have a product that acts as my assistant, right? I want to schedule a meeting. A lot of this happens over, well, almost all of this happens exclusively over email. And 5 years ago, if we thought of a system that could help automate this task for me, we wouldn't be able to do it. So what was it about machine learning? Like what particular problems are you now able to tackle such that you can create this system?
Yeah, good question. I think that one of the things that is coming to be really interesting in recent years is kind of the advent of deep learning and all of these things. I think one thing that's important to mention that is probably the same for all of us if we're founding companies is that to do some of the kind of state-of-the-art, really, really interesting stuff happening in recent years in machine learning, you need massive data sets. When you think about how machine learning is going to apply to education, it's particularly challenging because in education it's really difficult to get access to large data sets because of like administration and privacy issues. So you may see some of that lagging a little bit behind in ed tech, I would imagine. I don't know this reliably, but yeah, machine learning has been changing in fundamental ways over the course of the past few years. It's really interesting. I'll let somebody else go.
So Andrew, at Cerego, why don't you walk us through? So I think everyone on this panel has some sort of blend of machine learning elements to the system and non-machine learning elements. So if you can walk us through sort of how machine learning helps your systems and why you use it.
Sure. We use machine learning in two ways. The first way is that we're looking to make predictions about a learner on a very granular basis. So if you're interacting with our system and you're in corporate training, you're learning about how to use new machinery, the system is constantly trying to measure how well you know things on a very granular basis and then predict the optimal time to represent that information to you such that you build long-term memory. So we all kind of know that if you're trying to remember something long-term, the best thing to do is to space that information out over time, as opposed to what many of us did, which was cramming, right? So the night before we cram, it goes in and it goes out. If you're trying to build long-term retention, you distribute the practice over time. So with Cerego, we use machine learning first in this algorithm that we've created that allows us to measure and then predict the next point at which you should be re-encounter this information, and it's an error-corrective model. So we're constantly getting feedback from those predictions to fine-tune the model for that particular user for that particular content they're studying. The other way that we use machine learning is on a data set. So I think we probably have one of the largest data sets out there on human learning and forgetting. We've had millions of users run through a ton of content, and we've got a phenomenal amount of data. So we use machine learning to run different types of regression on that data to help us improve the learning engine itself. So we can analyze the data to figure out how to make the system better. And a lot of that is just really good math.
Arjun?
Yeah, so there's a couple different problems that we're looking at applying machine learning to. So the first is just helping the instructors grade their students' work. And the second is actually helping them understand what it is that the students learned or might be struggling with. So for the first, we don't really want to automate the process. We want to help them. And so let's say you have an algebra question, and maybe the right answer is the number 20. So if you've got 100 students all answering this question, and you're grading on paper, you have to go through and grade 100 things on paper. But using computer vision, what we can do is actually cluster together similar answers. So we can read the number and say, these are all 20s, these are all 80s, maybe that's a 4 somewhere. And while we may not necessarily know what the right answer is, and we don't know what the perfect feedback to give the student is, we know that these are all the same answer. So now when the instructor is going and actually giving that feedback to the student, they can do it once for the number 20, and once for the number 4, and once for the number 80, rather than 100 times. So that's kind of the goal there for the grading, the scaling up grading. And then just to touch really quickly on what we mean by trying to help instructors understand their students, your grading on paper, especially if you have a large course, is really hard for you to actually understand what's the most common mistake, what concepts should I cover, what concepts are the students struggling with. And the thing that's nice about doing this all online is now that data is in a database and can actually be analyzed. And so what we want to do is just build simple dashboards to help instructors say, hey, this is the concept that your students are struggling with the most. You might want to give them another homework on it or a review session on it or something like that. And the stuff under the hood is, again, just kind of data science, machine learning things to actually make that accessible to the instructor. You can't just present them with all of the data. You need to do something a little bit more intelligent so it's actually accessible to the instructors.
And the question is, what do we use machine learning for? Just confirming. So the primary area that we focus on with our products is on student motivation and tightening the feedback loop in writing. A really key problem with teaching writing is that it takes days, or in some cases weeks, to get any level of feedback for an essay for a student. And in many cases, it's purely summative in that the student has no real opportunity to revise based on what they hear from their teacher, because it's just too time-consuming and too slow of a process. With machine learning, we're using a set of algorithms to automatically predict what is the score that a student will get on a multi-trait rubric, but then packaging that in a way that de-emphasizes the assessment angle, instead focuses the student in on what am I doing well and where can I improve, and then giving them in line within their text margin comments and highlights, specifically calling out what it is that they should be focusing on in their own words, where they can add and revise and rethink some of the ideas that they're presenting, where they can expand on what they've already written, and then really get them to own that process so that by the time a teacher gets involved, the student is on their 4th, 5th, 6th draft, rather than coming to them for the first time with something that no one, including themselves, has ever read, and using machine learning to make that possible.
Fantastic. And so one of the things is we talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning, people tend to be a little bit afraid of these products. They're afraid because they're worried about things like automation. And so as you guys look at building your own products and you just look at the ecosystem as a whole, what work is going to be for the humans and what work is going to be for the algorithms?
Where do we start?
Free for all.
I think it's hard to really predict that. Some of this stuff just kind of happens, and you don't necessarily know which component is going to be totally automated ahead of time. I mean, sometimes you can, like people are talking about autonomous driving forever, and that's probably going to be a thing. And so taxi drivers and Uber and Lyft drivers are going to be doing something else maybe. But in other cases, it just happens. Like 15 years ago, did you expect that every single person is going to be on their smartphone constantly throughout everything, all day, every day? I mean, maybe, but probably not. So same kind of thing with automation. So like some problems end up being a lot easier than you might have expected. Computer vision was supposed to be solved over the summer by a grad student at MIT in the 1950s, but that didn't happen. So it's just hard to predict.
I think that one point that is also really valid is that all of the other pieces of technology that we use are really affecting the labor market in dramatic ways. It's just not as clear to us if that's the case. I think as soon as you use the word automation, there's an implication that you're taking a human workflow that already exists and replicating it, which is in fact what's happening. But even in all of the other technologies that we've widely adopted over the course of the past multiple centuries, that is in effect what has happened in spite of the fact that it is a little different. So this is largely a question of interface and how it changes software and how it changes the software we interact with and how we think about it. But it's not as much, I don't think, a problem of its own that's unique to this point in time.
I think that the space that's all near and dear to our hearts in education, there are folk out there that would have you believe that there's going to be a robot in the sky that will be able to teach you anything at all times. I think that's a little bit far-fetched, but I do believe that there's stuff that a microprocessor with the right application is going to be optimized to help people do better than one teacher to many students. And so I think that there has to be a really good balance of leveraging computers and machine learning to take care of certain types of foundational knowledge, foundational learning, and then allowing the instructor to do better things with their time than worry about where people are. And there's a lot of really good insight that we can bring that will help solve a really large problem in education, which is leveling the playing field and making sure people have a strong set of foundational skills, whether that's in K-12, higher ed, or corporate training.
And I would argue that when looking at the role of new technologies rolling out into a problem space, it's really about solving problems in a new way, but not necessarily replacing and automating an existing process If anything, that process may stay the same, but entirely new avenues to solving those problems can sort of appear because technology has now made that possible. A key example would be how search engines in the 90s made it possible to find information by using your own set of tools to look information up, where previously you would have needed to go to an encyclopedia, to a library, to a card catalog. It's technically analogous in that it is automating away a process that you had before, but really what it's doing is it's fundamentally rethinking how is it that we're solving this problem, what tools are available to you, and how can your behavior change based on new technologies that are available, rather than automating and replacing a specific job.
Got it. Yeah, so one of the things we think about a lot is the augmented knowledge worker. And for us, one of the things is, certainly there are going to be task types that are going to experience a certain amount of automation, but what does that open up space for? Which are the sort of uniquely human elements of everybody's job that you actually see being enhanced by these technologies?
In my case, it's the social interaction between student and teacher. Automated feedback on an essay removes a lot of the hostility or the anxiety between student and teacher, where you're looking at turning in a paper and then waiting on the teacher to pass down judgment on your work. And if you can replace that component of the student-teacher relationship with an evaluated essay that the student is bringing to the teacher for advice, what you end up with is a much richer conversation where they're acting much more like peers. And that social component allows you to have more of a collaborative dialogue, to think about co-constructing ideas in a way that you can't if the work of the teacher is really just plowing through on grading and on getting through evaluation and assessment of student work. And so what you can do by removing a lot of the assessment angle from the teacher's workload, at least in those early stages, is really make it more of a social and collaborative relationship that isn't going to be replaced anytime soon, and probably shouldn't be.
Anyone else have thoughts on that? If not, I'm going to...
Can you repeat the question?
Oh, we were just talking about, as certain elements get automated away, it frees us up more space to develop new superpowers. And so in Elijah's case, he was talking about strengthening the bond of social interaction between student and teacher, as opposed to, again, having to spend that time elsewhere doing some mundane task. I was just curious if any of the rest of the three of you had thoughts on what other superpowers can be enhanced.
Yeah, I do. I think that we really don't know what we know, right? And we go through a lot of education and schooling, and we can verify that people were in class and got through certain very specific milestones, but we really don't know what's in people's heads, and we don't really even know what's so much in our own head in terms of what do we know and what do we not know. And I think if we can automate and get access to a better understanding of what we know, then we can do a much better job of getting the right people in the right jobs at the right time. And I think that is going to be something terrific. And so many organizations spend phenomenal amounts of money trying to train people, weed people out, figure out who's the right person for the right job. And if we had more insight into what they knew and what they knew over time and what their capability was, then we could really match people up and move the process along.
I think my feeling is that it's reasonable to assume that since the vast majority of the work that we're doing today didn't really exist 50 years ago, we're still in transition with how we should be dealing with it and what parts of it we want to do. I think the fact that we get to have a conversation about what we want people to get to do and what we want people to get to work on is just the most phenomenal thing that's possible. And it's never been an accessible question to us before. So while we've always had tools and machine learning is another tool and the word automation is scary, the flip side of that, of course, is that it is real in that we are able to create progressively more intelligent technologies faster, and that builds on itself exponentially as it always has. So we get to ask really interesting questions.
I'll just say from my own experience, one of the reasons I started investing in machine intelligence was because I wasn't fully conscious of it at the time, but I was using this whole suite of machine intelligence tools to basically augment my own life and my investment process. And not only did I find myself getting more productive, so I kind of did this exercise in my head, and it was like, what percentage of the time am I doing things that I do not want to be doing? And for me, that percentage was very high. It was about 65%. I was just dealing with administration, scheduling, whatever it might be. It was like very tedious types of research, things you have to do just by virtue of being at a corporate. And again, this is imprecise, but I've noticed that because I'm able to offload more and more of this onto intelligent tools, I've cut that percentage down to about 25%, which is not great. There's still room for improvement, but I think definitely a step. And so, as you guys talk about your systems, the thing that strikes me is you guys, in some ways, are creating partners or buddies in some way, right? And that brings me back to just the idea of trust. As you're handing off more and more tasks to a system, that requires building trust in a way that a lot of pieces of software didn't require you to before. So how do you guys think about that?
I didn't fully explain exactly how Clara works. I think I misunderstood the question, and I apologize. So I'll explain and try to answer this one. I think that for different systems, trust looks or feels different, right? Sometimes if you're 95%, or if you're correct 95% of the time, or you're 95% correct, or what have you, it's completely great, right? Fantastic, you're very accurate. In other use cases, 95% correct would be absolutely unacceptable. So in Clara's case, when you're having a conversation with someone, it's very delicate. So for us, 95% is simply not good enough. And on one hand, you could say, oh, insurmountable challenge, goodbye. On the other hand, you could say, if this is incredibly valuable, if we can make this scale to huge proportion, how would we go about that? So in our case, we have a back end of contractors who work to help aid Clara, the software system. So if we cannot reliably parse something and send it automatically, then a person, our contractor, is interacting with that thing that we don't know, with the prediction that we're not completely confident about, and letting us know if it's correct or incorrect. And in doing that, they're the feedback loop to training the system for the future. So we've been able to create a very reliable system that has a lot of integrity and a lot of trust, because we ensure the human intelligence, right, the human back end, in any case that we don't feel sure.
You reminded me, actually, when I first started using Clara as my assistant, I gave it the low criticality tasks first. That was my own way of learning to trust, was giving the system a handful of tasks that it wouldn't really matter if it messed up. And then as it didn't mess up, I graduated up and up and up. And even for extremely important meetings that were sensitive, I would then use the system. Does anyone else want to opine on trust?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think it really does depend on the system itself, exactly how you build that in. So either you have somebody behind the scenes kind of doing QA essentially, or the UI has to just kind of potentially expose to the user that, hey, this is never going to be 100% perfect. The vast majority, pretty much all machine learning or computer vision or anything, is never going to be perfect. And so for us, it's all about making the UI reflect that and making the instructor feel that they're confident about what's going to happen. So the very first thing you do when we make these groups is you kind of go through and sanity check the groups. And it's a quick thing, and the UI is pretty nice for it. But that lets them feel like they're in control. Like they know that we're not just doing stuff behind the scenes. They're not going to know if there's an error somewhere. They get to check that first. And so that's kind of the thing that we think is important for building trust.
So just opining more broadly on the machine learning ecosystem, I'm sure these guys are going to be faced with a whole bunch of pitches for a whole bunch of products and projects at various times. Do you guys have any advice for being able to pull signal from noise in this ecosystem?
I think the best thing is to actually see it work, and then see it work on something that's not a canned demo. That's the only way you can really be 100% sure, I think.
I'll give you my own red flag, which is a startup comes to pitch us and says we have a magical algorithm. That's the biggest red flag you can have. It's not about magical algorithms at the end of the day. It's, can you solve my specific business problem, and can you show me how it's done or not? I think one of the advantages we have in this space versus other spaces is the outputs are very human. They're intended for a business user to understand. If someone came and said, I can make your database 20 times faster, you kind of have to take it on faith. Whereas, if Arjun says, I can make grading less painful for you by virtue of my machine learning system, you can say, great, I know how to grade. I can take you up on that offer. So, a broader...
One other thing on that real quick. So the other aspect I think for this that's important and becoming increasingly more important is data and access to the data. So, the things that are going to win are the kind of systems built on having a lot of data available, and that's kind of being shown. Like simpler algorithms often work better than more complicated ones if you've got more data. So another way to kind of evaluate like if the story makes sense is like, do they have a good reason of like how they're going to have access to kind of the right data for the problem they're solving?
And so I think you guys are at, what, about 8 million questions in the system? For you, when did you start hitting that data critical mass? Like how much data is enough data in a system?
So there's kind of, it's tricky because we're actually on the other side of the spectrum right now. We're actually using some fancier stuff, working with simpler things right now. I think for us, the kind of key point at which we could do kind of the big, more data-driven algorithms is when you get to like maybe 5,000 or 10,000 answers to the same question, or the same question type at least. And so we're actually not there yet. That's why we're starting with the simpler things like the algebra type questions.
Right.
And then later we'll move on to those more complicated ones. And the thing that's going to enable that is having the same question be shared across multiple courses. So that gives you more answers to the exact same question, lets you actually help grade it more efficiently.
And one thing that I'll quickly add is that path is really important, right? What is your path from, I necessarily am starting with very little data and I need a lot. What's your path to getting there? And do you actually believe that you can get there? So as opposed to a normal software company where you just have to build the software and you need to understand what your customers need, but beyond that, it's not going to affect your ability to provide good software. In machine learning, the data is a really core component, and you can't freely or accessibly get the access to the data that you need for your problems the vast, vast majority of the time.
I think related to that, I think that people love to tell you what they do, what they have, but they don't really like to tell you so much about how it works. And I think that's a really important question. And I think in ed tech, there's so much buzzword bingo. It was adaptive, and now everybody's saying their systems are personalized, and now people are starting to talk about machine learning and AI and big data, but now it's small data, and it's like there's a lot of buzzwords. And I think if they can't tell you how it works in sort of plain speak, then that's a pretty big red flag. And you see a lot of companies that are driven by marketing. Marketing's important, no offense to great marketers, but I think a lot of companies just wake up and say, well, now we're a learning science company. We used to be this, and now we're a big data company for education. It's like, that drives us entrepreneurs a little bit crazy. So I think really getting to, can you plainly tell me what it does and how it works is a good test.
Well, and when you say how it works, there's really two components there, and I think one, which I would classify as less important, is what are the actual algorithms? Teach me about deep learning, teach me about neural nets, and that's something that potentially has value at sort of an academic level, but really doesn't answer the question of, well, then what? What problem are you solving and why? So when you say, how does it work? There's that component on the technical side, and then there's what you were, I think, alluding to, which is, well, how is my life different as a result of using this product? What is the behavior that I see in my students or in my staff or myself? How does my day change as a result of this? And what can't I get from an if-then or a keyword list or a set of much simpler alternatives? And it's easiest to frame everything in terms of tell me about the day-to-day changes in my lifestyle than diving too far into, well, this one's a regression and this one's a neural network and this one's deep and this one isn't and all of that.
So focusing just on the educational ecosystem, a lot of people try to say, oh, well, why doesn't technology affect education as quickly as everywhere else? And I mean, in this case, the data certainly supports that. I look at a couple thousand companies that claim to be machine learning-based companies every year and kind of map out the entire ecosystem. And Arjun remembers I actually came to him and I was like, I care about education so much. Can you just tell me about more companies? Because I really want to have the industry of education represented. And it was, when we were doing it back then, a little bit of a fight. But you three have managed to sell machine learning products into the educational ecosystems. Can you just talk a little bit about why you think you guys are able to do that. Is it something about messaging, branding, user interface? Like what's unique to the ed tech system that you guys have figured out? And then we'll talk about the challenges, but I'll give you a chance to brag first.
I think the issue is the same one. It's looking at classrooms first and looking at what problem are you solving. And if you lead with the technology, you're going to lose every person that's listening to you, and they're just not going to follow along. Or if they do, and it's not an education or a background thing in terms of the technical ability, it's you're not answering any questions that are relevant to me. And you seem very smart. That's great for you. But I've got 800 students in my middle school, and I don't really have time to hear about how smart you are. But if you can say, you know, this is the way that, in my case, English class is going to look different. This is the specific thing that I can help you with that you're struggling with your teachers every day. That's a message that gets across both to an individual teacher, but to a superintendent, at a university, to a dean, and then in the corporate world as well. It's just not about machine learning. And machine learning really can't be front and center in the pitch because it's just not the thing that you're selling. It's the enabling factor that makes it possible to sell that product.
Yeah, I completely agree that the problem is the most important thing. And for me personally, it's just kind of lucky. Like I was an AI researcher teaching a big AI course, and then we were still grading everything by hand on paper, like 400 papers. And it's just like, this is insane. And then, you know, we just built something, tried to make it better, and it ended up working. And like, you know, because of that, you know, personal pain, it just like was obvious that this would help, and just kind of grew from that. So.
Yeah, I think those are good points. I think as entrepreneurs, we love to impress upon people how smart we are and the wonderful systems that we've built, and you know, you just keep trying to sell the AI and the brilliance of it. And at the end of the day, I think that's a huge turnoff to the market. But I do believe that it's important to be able to talk about outcomes. So I think being able to really demonstrate that something works and to have some data and some studies to point to say, hey, this is this audience of people, they engaged this way, this is the benefit that they got, you too can have that benefit, is very important to do. So at the end of the day, users don't care that they're using a personalized machine learning based AI robot in the cloud. They just want to know, is their life going to be easier? Are they going to get better grades? Are teachers going to have an easier time getting through their classes? That's what people want, and you got to be able to prove it.
And so, Maran, you've got a horizontal tool that can absolutely be applied to people in the educational and corporate training ecosystem, but your messaging is going to be agnostic. So what have you learned from what works and what doesn't?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The fast path to some small amount of money and small amount of users is probably to wave your hands around and use the most fantastical words that you can come up with, which right now are artificial intelligence. I would be almost like insta scared of anybody who refers to artificial intelligence that way. It's just, yeah.
It is kind of a funny phenomenon we saw, so circa 3 or 4 years ago. People who were actually using big data never use the term big data, and if they put the words big data in any of their decks or marketing materials, you could pretty much guarantee they were not using big data. And sadly, we're somehow seeing the same phenomenon happen in artificial intelligence now, which just completely blows my mind. But you guys touched upon it a little bit, and you know, in terms of sales models that you guys are seeing work, you know, a lot of the debates in many different ecosystems: is this the best top-down sale? Is this a better bottom-up sale? Who understands the message? Who doesn't? What are you guys finding?
So I prefer working top-down personally, though I think that changes from product to product, and even within a product, depending on how you roll it out. For us, the way that you teach an English class when you have the ability to assign more writing, substantially more writing, just changes, and your semester looks different. And that's something that's very hard to push through for an individual English teacher who happens to be up on the 4th floor doing something different from everyone else in their school or their district. And you really need the buy-in of your superintendent, of the district staff, of the administration that's going to be evaluating the work that you're doing. And you need, to some extent, license to really retool and rethink how it is that I'm going to be teaching my classes. And if you get those conversations going from the very beginning with the sort of overlay staff that are thinking through what are all of my teachers doing, and they know there's a new product coming in, we're going to be trying something exciting, we haven't done it before, we're going to be assigning a lot more writing this semester than we did in the past, but we're not exactly sure how it's going to work. If you can get that buy-in from the top down early, then it gives people the flexibility to experiment a lot more and to feel like they're going to be supported when they go back and say, you know, things are really different in my class now, but not quite the way that I expected. And it's much more of an iterative process of rethinking the classroom model that is obviously safest when you've already gotten the sign-off from the people that are giving you your paycheck that things are going to be fine. And it's okay to try things out.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so for us, we're really early on this, and I wish I already had the complete answer to this. If anybody else does, you should tell me. But so we're trying out a couple with both strategies, actually. So I mean, our main mode of growth has just been bottom-up, individual instructors, kind of a lot of it word of mouth, obviously. But there's a couple of features that come out of having all of your grading done online that's really appealing to the administrators, and so we're also exploring that, and I don't really know if it's going to work just yet. But the bottoms up thing has been working like pretty well for us thus far. So just solving the instructor's pain seems to resonate.
We're not brave enough to go into the K-12 space directly. It's I'm already getting older, and I don't just see that happening in my lifetime directly. So we're mostly working in higher ed and corporate, and I think what we've seen is that there's a lot of pressure from the market to do pilots and to do small groups and to have instructors pick things up. And when you're smaller, it sounds really attractive. Hey, I got a pilot with this school. I got this teacher on board. Of recent, we've started rejecting all offers for pilots. We're just like, nope. It's a site-wide institution deal. Every one of your faculty gets access to it. We're going to make it so ridiculously inexpensive for you that you're not even going to think about it, and you're going to turn this on for the entire institution. So we've been really pushing those type of deals. And it's interesting because it's actually starting to work. So you're seeing more institutions go along for that. And I think you see other companies that are, in the LMS space that are just doing that sort of deal. So they're getting used to thinking about things on a more broad institution basis, and that's what we've been pushing on.
One quick point, in government and education, the number of people whose roles are explicitly administrative is gigantic as compared to the corporate world at large. It's an interesting kind of animal of its own, very much so, even for Clara, for example. We support some professors at some universities because they found us. That said, I think that for education or government, in spite of our kind of agnostic seeming message, if we wanted to go after it, we would have to tailor in pretty tremendous ways to understand the needs of that market in particular.
I would chime in one thing on the site-wide license and the availability of a pilot to all the users. Totally agree on making it easy to get in and be ridiculously inexpensive, but not free is a key thing that I found.
Good point.
Because if it's free, I mean, education in both higher ed and K-12 is extremely deadline sensitive and busy, and people are working on a day-by-day and, depending on the curriculum you're using, sometimes minute-by-minute schedule. And it's really easy to say, we're not paying anything for this anyway. It's lower priority than the other 4 initiatives we're doing this year. I'll put it off. It's not important. And if you can get a group to put in, whether it's $500 or $5,000, some amount that makes it matter to an institution, but not enough that it's going to be a barrier to moving forward, so that someone knows I've got a line item and I've written a check for this and I really want to get people involved in it. And getting people trying it, moving forward, thinking about the product, and then having conversations within their institution in a way that they wouldn't if they just got a flip switched.
And how do you figure out that sweet spot? Because we see the lot too, where if it's free, it tends to be ignored, but you don't want to go through this massive cycle. How do you arrive at that?
Well, it depends on what space you're in and whether you're selling to an institution or to an individual. I don't know what the right answer is, and I would be eager to hear if there is a right answer. I know for individuals, they often have limits below which no one's going to ask any questions about what it is that they're paying. And depending on where you are, that might be $100, it might be $250, whatever it is. At the institution, I think there are equivalents. The numbers are just a little larger. And anything under $1,000, or in some cases even more, just isn't going to be a holdup. You're not going to have to wait on someone to get an approval. You're not going to go to a committee or to certainly not to a school board meeting the way that you would on a much larger purchase. But it's enough that someone is saying that I care that this works well, and we didn't waste their money.
I like that point very quickly of money and charging people as a proxy for making sure that they care.
Yeah.
It's especially with tools that have to do with your productivity and saving your time. There are consumer social products that are not about saving you time at all. And those things have tended to be free because they're taking your time.
And yeah, just an anecdote, when I started using Clara, I had also signed up for 3 other virtual assistant services, none of which cost money, and I only used yours. So it apparently seems to work. I just wanted to, before I head to my last questions, I just wanted to offer up the question and answer period. So who's got a question for these guys?
Hi, I'm curious about when you get a 95% and you give it over to your contractor to look at, how do you handle the false positives, the 100% but it was wrong? Are you able to detect on the back end?
My fast answer is we're deeply conservative. One of the things that's nice about Clara is that the comparable service is a human doing the work, and people are pretty sensitive to the cost of that human doing the work. So for us, it's still very profitable to put a human behind things. That doesn't perfectly answer your false positive question. All I can say is conservatism, and being able to afford to be deeply conservative is important.
Kevin Greer from New Profit. Andrew, I was struck by your comment earlier when you said that you could see the role that machine learning and artificial intelligence can play in building foundational skills. At New Profit, we're launching a competition, an X-Prize competition focused on identifying more effective, scalable ways to develop what we were calling power skills, but in essence are soft skills, so things like communication and teamwork and problem solving. And so I'm curious to hear you in particular, but then others, your thoughts on both the opportunities and challenges that these technologies can provide for informing learning in those types of areas.
Sure, I'll start off. For what we're doing, it's early days, and where we focused was the stuff that was easiest fit for the platform, so foundational knowledge. And I think foundational knowledge, people love to talk about getting, doing higher order stuff, but at the core, you're constantly drawing upon a ton of foundational knowledge. So by analogy, I often say that you can use Cerego. It's not going to make you a piano virtuoso, but you're going to learn to read music probably faster than any other system out there. And so whatever we're doing, we're constantly drawing upon a great store of foundational elements that we hook together, that we have at a level of automaticity, and we're able to do stuff. So for us, it's a big enough cut to just get the foundation right. And I think that second level of being able to apply higher up the food chain, for now, maybe there are great systems that can do it, but we're pretty happy with making sure people get the basics under their belt.
Hi, Owen Lawler from Metacog. I have a question for you, because that question regarding trust was an awesome one. What percentage of confidence do you feel you need to have before you actually accept what the machines are telling us is correct?
My answer would be it depends on the use case and your sense of the consequence of an error. I'll also say this is still not perfectly answering the previous question, but one of the things that's powerful about having a system like Clara, and not just a system like Clara, but any of the systems that are kind of in front of you right now, is that there is a very tight feedback loop to a person. All of us are building, to the degree they understand it, building work that really closely touches people in a way that lets people train the system in time, with use. So it is something that kind of grows and does actually progress in substantial ways in our experience, even in months of time, even with not trillions of data points.
Yeah, and to expand, in my particular use case, when looking at student essays, just as a distinction between the types of things that you need different levels of confidence, if you're looking at a grammatical error, students fixing 222 or it's with or without an apostrophe, if you're right, 67% of the time, which is sort of the state of the art in automated grammar checking these days, and there's a reason that we don't emphasize grammar in our system, then 1 out of every 3 times that you make a correction, it's actually going to make it worse, and specifically take something that was correct and now make it wrong. And that's a real issue. On the other hand, if you're giving someone feedback on the clarity of their thesis statement, and you recognize their thesis, you highlight it, and you say, this could be stronger. I'm not really sure where you're going with this, or if you're communicating well to your audience. If you're 67, if you're 80, if you're 90% sure on that, in the cases where you're wrong, and the student has already got a really tight thesis statement, and they're just re-looking at it to revise, there's really no harm done in terms of rereading and rethinking your communication and thinking about how else you could word it. So the damage there is almost zero to give someone a suggestion to go reread and rethink something that they're already just considering. And then if you go in the other extreme, some of the work that we do is on summative assessment of high-stakes testing, where a student is receiving a score that in one way or another can affect their college entrance acceptance. Those are the sorts of things where you need to be much more confident than if you're giving a student a task where they're just practicing and no one's potentially even going to read it because it's for their own benefit. And so there's just a lot of context sensitivity in my domain, but in just about every domain, about what is the impact if you get it wrong, and how specific is it? Is it an error where if you get it wrong, you're going to really screw things up? Or is it just something that's going to make people pause and reflect, but not really affect their day-to-day if you're not right on target? And that's a mixed set of priorities to think about for every problem.
In thinking about the future of work, and you're cool in education if you talk about 21st century skills. And so as entrepreneurs who are dealing in a much different space than educators are, and educators have no idea what's going on, what advice would you give us for quickly, like how do we need to be preparing our kids to enter the future economy?
I'm honored to be asked a question like that. Firstly, thanks for assuming that I have anything to add to your day in, day out. I think that there was this PowerPoint or this video that really impacted me when I was a child, and it talked about how in 12 years or 2020 or whatever, the world would be so different that 75% of the jobs that I thought I would have didn't yet exist. And it completely blew my mind and was very powerful and oddly liberating also. I was always very obsessed with what I wanted to do when I grew up, and it was unobvious to me what the answer to that question was, but knowing that the things that I was supposed to focus on were really just finding passions of mine and self-knowledge, because there was no way I would well prepare for the future that didn't exist yet, that I had no knowledge of, was, I guess, my takeaway. So the big thing that I advocate in my younger sisters and in my cousins and things to that end are just helping people feel encouragement in everything that they touch, helping people understand that things will not be intuitively correct to them from day one by any stretch of the imagination, and like encouraging them to really run with things even if they're obscure.
I'm pitching my book here, but writing is a skill that I think is going to be evergreen in a way that the latest programming language or the latest maker skills, any of those, will teach you a skill that's probably useful in the short term and a way of thinking that's probably helpful. But communication skills and being able to collaborate with others, whether in writing or otherwise, are not going away anytime soon.
Yeah, I mean, what you said about, whatever the latest maker skill is, whatever, like, I agree that, those change, but just the confidence that, if you face a problem, there's a good chance you have the skills to solve your own problem, I think is really cool. And then that's the thing that really is exciting to me. And so, for up till now, a big part of it has been software, and, might continue to be software for a little while. I'm not really sure about that, but somehow getting that confidence of, like, you can build stuff to solve your own problems or other people's problems is powerful.
So I think there's a certain amount of unpredictability here about what things will be in vogue. The one thing we saw happen really recently was poets are now flocking to Silicon Valley. And you're like, wait a minute, why programmers are the hot thing, but one of the big things now is people building these bot technologies that can communicate as if they're a human, and if you have sort of this deep literative linguistic background, you can actually give these bots personalities, because I'm sure we've all interacted with something and we just kind of wanted to punch the bot. We're like, oh, why are you so dumb? And so now you're seeing sort of the poets come up, and Gabe was very politely really wanting to ask a question, so I'll let him close this out.
Thank you, and I appreciate all these insights. So as a retired superintendent, one of the things I try to help superintendents with today is what should we be thinking about to prepare students? Kind of a similar question, but in terms of machine learning and getting our kids ready for the workforce especially, what should we be thinking about, or how we should be planning our curriculum to really focus on getting our kids with the right skill sets?
Good question. I have a 5-year-old son, and I'm always thinking about his education and his future. And I was talking to a colleague about how when we were growing up, we learned French. And we studied, and now, it's very in vogue, depending on where you are, to study Mandarin, because you can, we know where that's going. But I think that, maybe learning a computer language is a more productive use of that language muscle than learning another language. I took 11 years of French, and I can't string together a sentence, but if I had maybe learned Python, I could be doing some more productive work. So I think it's interesting to think about and to have kids start to really play with computers and learning computer languages.
I'll jump in the opposite direction.
French or Mandarin?
So I went to CMU for my PhD in computer science, and it was my second year of grad school before I ever took a linear algebra course, and managed to make it through pretty much all of the core computer science skills without anywhere near the deep mathematical or technical skills that most of my colleagues had. And it was the liberal arts background that I had from college and from school earlier than that let me communicate well with others and think through ideas, but then be able to have the right conversations and express ideas in a way that really packaged them up clearly and made it effective to have a conversation with others that gave me the ability to survive in classes where I was clearly over my head technically. So I wouldn't worry too much about specific technical skills, though obviously I like Python.
Fantastic. Well, the last one I'll say is I think EQ is the thing that the world of AI has not figured out entirely yet. So anything that's going to bolster those skill sets, which are implicit in the curriculum but maybe not explicit, I think are fantastic. But I just wanted to thank our unbelievable panelists. It's been a joy to draw each and every insight out of you. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and these guys will be around after for any questions you have.